So welcome to this first teaching video on the Research Methods unit. This week and next week's video are kind of quite deep philosophical videos. Please don't get worried about the content. I know that it can be a bit complicated when you first get into it. However, it's really important that we get into the details of the kind of fundamental important philosophical questions that underpin research. And today's video is a really key one, and it's looking at the philosophy called epistemology. So epistemology is simply the theory of knowledge. It doesn't ask just what do we know, but it goes to the level below that, asking kind of how do we know what we know. So what is knowledge in the first place, and how can we be sure that we actually know what we think we know? Since the whole point of academic research is to create new, reliable knowledge, we have to begin by thinking critically about where the knowledge comes from. In this session, we're going to explore some of the common methods of knowing that we all use every single day. The first, and perhaps the most basic way we know things, is through intuition. This is knowledge that comes from a hunch, a gut feeling, or an instinct. It's that immediate sense of understanding without any conscious reasoning. So as musicians, we rely on intuition all the time. If we're improvising, we just perhaps know what note to play next. A conductor has a feeling for the right tempo. Intuition is a powerful and immediate form of personal conviction. When you believe something just because it feels right, you're relying on your intuition. But for all its power, intuition has major limitations as a basis for research and kind of solid knowledge. First of all, it's entirely personal. I can't verify that your gut feeling, and you can't verify mine. It's a private experience. So to build shared knowledge, we often have to turn to other sources. Most importantly, our intuition can quite often be wrong, and sometimes terribly so. Many findings that emerge from research might be described as counterintuitive, and this is why we need to be very aware of our personal biases when undertaking research, to ensure that our intuition doesn't get in the way of our research. So it might guide us, but it shouldn't direct us. One of the most common ways we acquire knowledge is through authority. This is when we accept something as true because a trusted source tells us. This could be a teacher, a textbook, an expert on TV, or an academic article. Up until now, most of you, for most of your assignments, have been trusting this form of knowledge. So tradition can also be a powerful form of authority. The idea that we've always done it this way carries a lot of weight, particularly in many musical and educational settings. However, as the cartoon at the bottom of the slide points out, relying on authority comes with risks. Authorities can be wrong. They can have biases, or they could be deliberately misleading. So, as postgraduate researchers, it's not enough to simply accept knowledge from an authority. You must always think critically and ask the crucial question: how did this authority arrive at the knowledge they're offering me? One way an authority might arrive at knowledge is through what's called rationalism. This is the process of using logical reasoning to arrive at a new conclusion. You start with a premise, a statement you believe is true, and you use its logic to build an argument. So if we look at the cartoon, the penguin in the cartoon is using a form of logical reasoning called a syllogism. So the first premise is that penguins are black and white. The next premise is that some old TV shows are black and white, and therefore the penguin incorrectly draws the conclusion that some penguins are old TV shows. So we can see here the logic seems to make sense, but the conclusion is obviously wrong. So this illustrates a key weakness of pure rationalism. The logical process might be perfectly valid, but if your initial premise is flawed, your conclusion will be worthless. So the classic example of this is all swans are white, and if you accept that premise, it's logical to conclude that any swan you see will be white. But we know the premise is false because there are a few black swans. Logic alone, without connection to the real world, can lead us astray. This brings us to the direct opposite of rationalism, which is empiricism. If rationalism is about knowledge from pure reason, empiricism is about knowledge gained from direct sensory experience, from observation and experimentation. The motto of the empiricists is, as the cartoon says, let's find out. You don't reason your way to the truth from an armchair. You go out into the world and test it. This is the very heart of the scientific worldview. When I say I know swans are white because I've spent my whole life observing swans and every single one I've seen has been white, I'm making an empirical claim. But pure empiricism has its own problems. Can we be sure our senses aren't deceiving us? Our own experiences are obviously limited. Just because I've never seen anything other than white swans doesn't mean that a black one doesn't exist. And we all bring our own biases to what we observe. To make empiricism more reliable, we need to add a layer of structure and rigour. So that structured and rigorous form of empiricism is the scientific method. This is really critical, and as you'll know in modern society, it's arguably the most powerful way of generating reliable knowledge. It combines the best of both worlds. It uses rationalism to formulate a clear question and potentially a testable hypothesis. And it then uses systematic empiricism through observation and experimentation to see if that hypothesis holds up in the real world. However, it's crucial to understand that even this method has its limitations. Firstly, it can't be used to answer all questions. Ethical or philosophical questions often sit outside what can be observed and measured. Secondly, the process itself is subject to human bias. There are more possible hypotheses than could ever be tested. So who gets to decide which questions are important enough to research? This is where issues of funding, gender, and racial bias can mean that scientific knowledge doesn't always develop in a neutral way. Finally, at the end of a process, a published study might be seen to become a new authority. But in science, that authority is not the final word. A core principle is that findings must be open to be challenged, retested, and replicated by other researchers. Knowledge created by the scientific method is not absolute truth. It's our best possible explanation for now, and is always open to being improved. So I want to look at 2, and then we'll move on to 3 different ways of reasoning which are very closely linked to knowledge creation. So within the scientific method and in research more generally, we use 2 main forms of reasoning to connect our ideas to our observations. And these are deductive and inductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning is a top-down approach. As you can see from the cartoon, it's the classic structure of the scientific method. You'll begin with a general theory or a hypothesis, a concept based on what is already known, sometimes called an a priori proposition. Then, you systematically collect data to test if that specific hypothesis is valid. And you draw a conclusion based on that test. You move from a general theory to specific observations. This is something you might have done at school in your science lessons. Inductive reasoning works in exactly the opposite direction. It's bottom-up approach. You don't start with a preformed hypothesis. Instead, you begin with specific observations or experiences and then look for patterns. From those patterns, you then generate broader generalizations or a new hypothesis. As the note on the slide says, a good way to remember this is that with inductive reasoning, the hypothesis is formed in the process of doing the research. For example, you might observe in your teaching that several students struggle with a particular rhythm, and from these specific observations you might induce a hypothesis about why that rhythm is generally difficult for learners. Very often in the type of research that happens in education, and particularly music education, it's going to be this type of reasoning we'll use. Finally, it's important to know that in the real world of research, these two processes are not mutually exclusive. In fact, they often work together in a cycle, and this is called abductive reasoning. A researcher might start with a hypothesis they want to test deductively, but during their observations they might notice something unexpected. This would be an inductive insight, and it causes them perhaps to refine or completely change their original hypothesis. They then might go on to test that new hypothesis deductively. This ongoing cycle of starting with a theory, testing it against the world, and then refining that theory based on what you find is the engine that drives knowledge creation forward. Understanding these different ways of knowing and the logic we use to build arguments provides the essential foundations for our next session. And in that session, we're going to look at how these ideas are bundled together into what we call research paradigms.